August the 1st is China's Army Day. This year marks the 91st anniversary of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, that is under the leadership of the Communist Party of China. It is also the first official army celebration after the 19th CPC National Congress last October. During the Congress, the Secretary General of the CPC Central Committee, Xi Jinping, also the Chairman of the Central Military Commission, met with senior military officers, saying the CPC would strive to fully transform the People's Armed Forces into a world-class military by the mid-21st century. So why is the CPC so determined to build such an army? And for China, what will a world-class military look like? What does it mean for the rest of the world? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. Joining me in the studio today is Zhou, Senior Colonel from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. Senior Colonel Zhou, thank you so much for joining me today. Now, during the New Year address of Chinese President Xi Jinping at the beginning of this year, he said that China firmly supports the authority and the importance of the United Nations, and China will actively fulfill its international responsibilities and duties and always be a builder of world peace, a contributor of global development, and a keeper of the international order. So under such a overarching requirement, what's the position, what's going to be the role of the Chinese army?
That's a very good question, because for the military, the first priority is always to defend your territory. But for China's military, and as a result of China's development, so we have two more new roles, in my understanding. That is to protect China's ever-growing overseas interest and to show that its increasing international responsibility. Because these two really are new in that China's economy overseas, how big is that? Because China's economy is not only in mainland China, it is also overseas. Some people compare it to the size of at least a medium-sized European countries. And besides, great power showed greater responsibility. Because China today is the second largest economy in the world, because the PLA is becoming ever stronger, therefore the PLA is asked to do more for the well-being of people in the rest of the world.
So let's talk about what kind of intermediate, maybe also long-term target for development that the PLA is assigned. Let's say we understand that according to the top design, by 2035 the PLA should become modernized, and by 2049, which is mid-21st century, also 100 years after the founding of New China, that it will become a world-class military. Exactly how do you qualify for a world-class military?
That's a very good question, because if you have ever read the white paper book published in 2008, you would find the target of China's PLA becoming modernized was only described to be something achieved by mid-century. That means if we now talk about 2035 to become modernized, basically we would become modernized 15 years in advance. So by the mid-century, 2049 or 2050, it is the target of becoming world-class military.
What kind of requirement, what kind of criteria are we talking about for the PLA to be qualified as a world-class military?
Well, that's a very good question, because people actually haven't talked much about it. We know in the world who is the strongest. But by many people's standard, the PLA is already among the strongest military in the world, because of your ever-growing military strength, because of what we have seen in Tiananmen Square, because of the fact that even IISS in London described China's militaries, well, describe the development of PLA hardware since 2000 is more than the combined strength of Japan, South Korea, and India. So the hardware is actually known to all, everybody in the press, but the question is about software, about how capable you are really. And that is a good question in that, because after 1980, essentially, PLA is not involved in any combat at all, even not in any conflict. So how could you prove that you are combat efficient, even with the best equipment? That is a good question. asked to PLA, even by China's leadership.
Yeah, according to your understanding, according to China's ability to develop itself so far in an all-round manner, do you think such ambitious goals are realistic, or will it be like what happened to the past in terms of modernization? We can bring the goal closer before the mid-21st century. We can probably already achieve that goal.
I think we can achieve all these objectives in that. Let's talk about the Chinese government. And I believe Chinese government is really among the very few governments in the world who can project an image, a vision, say over 10 years, 20 years, and be able to achieve that. For example, our late chairman Deng Xiaoping said in 1982 that we got to quadruple our agricultural and industrial output by 2000, and we achieved that in 5 years in advance. And then in 2000 we laid down our objectives for 2020, and then we achieved that in 2016, 4 years in advance. So this means Chinese government can really deliver its promise and be able to honor it. And then we talk about some other things. For example, PLA's tradition. PLA is confident about itself in that it believes that we have never lost any wars after liberation. And we came from a very small, weak background, but we lose no war after liberation. And right now there are so many boosters over PLA's development. For example, AI technology. For example, the civil-military integration. And China now is the largest industrial nation in the world. So China now has a very strong defense industry. And China's defense industry now virtually can produce almost everything we want.
Well, you talked about China never lost any battle since the founding of New China in 1949. And in fact, China has never engaged itself in any active battle combat since the 1980s. So could it be possible that this kind of confidence you talked about is probably just kind of feeling good about yourself, that you believe you can win, but but these soldiers have never been engaged in any actual battles?
Yeah, that is a good question, because even in PLA Daily we talk about so-called peace disease. That means people have enjoyed peace for so long. So, and unless and until you are really found in a war, how can you prove that you are really capable in fighting? But again, there is a dilemma, because China's rise, even by any standard, is peaceful. And should we just prove ourselves being capable in fighting, therefore we have to have a war? I think that's a question of cost and effectiveness. We should not just to prove ourselves or even train ourselves to have a war. But at the same time, even in peacetime, you can do training. And this is what we are doing exactly. Now you see more and more three-service joint training, especially of the first-generation violent, and you have also seen increasing number of PLA joint exercises, especially with countries within Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in particular with Russia. All these would definitely boost the combat effectiveness.
Let's talk a little bit of the financial support to the military from the central government. We know China's military spending is about 1.5% of the GDP. Some people say this is a lot, but really in terms of the percentage of the military spending to the GDP, China is really actually very low. But how can you maintain or sustain the long-term growth of the PLA with such a low percentage of spending?
Right, even if the expenditure is low, but it is sustainable, because over decades we have been invested like this. So because your whole economy is growing, therefore even 1.5% now is different from 1.5 20 years ago. And because of this, it's sustainable but low defense expenditure, so we are what we are today. And if you just compare China's GDP, for example, with NATO, because everybody now knows how Trump actually lambasted NATO to spend 2% by 2024. NATO standard is even higher than China. But then we have to compare one thing about your perception of threat, right? Because China's 1.5% GDP spending on defense just indicate that we do not really take anybody as a serious threat.
Well, at this moment, as you mentioned, U.S. President Donald Trump is demanding that the NATO spend more, and actually after the meeting, after his trip to Brussels, it seems that he has got something in return. He said that NATO members have added $41 billion extra for defense spending, and that the NATO will be taking additional $33 billion or more, and at least 17 NATO members have pledged to reach the target of spending 2% of GDP on their defense by 2024. Does that give additional pressure for China to up the ante by, matching that number in the near future?
I don't think so. First of all, China and NATO are not at loggerheads. Actually, China and NATO have a reasonable, good working relationship. I myself have been in charge of this for some time, because we even have maintained contact at a certain level, and we have exchanges, be it delegation visit or exchange over scholars. So we're just talking about the different perspective, because China's low defense expenditure indicate in one way that we do not believe that we have serious threat. And there is a good point. Why just 5 countries of NATO spend more than 2%? That means most of them do not consider they really have a serious threat. If you are in serious threat, of course you would have to spend more, but the majority, out of 29 countries, only 5 can spend more than 2%. That is self-evident.
Well, again, it seems to me there's a dilemma there, right? We do not feel threatened, so that we don't spend that much. But look, the United States is putting China as its primary strategic competitor, and actually, as we all know, President Trump has tilted the majority of his military resources in the theater of Asia-Pacific, right, under this Indo-Pacific policy. For instance, it is believed that 60% of American overseas tactical aviation assets will be assigned to the Asia-Pacific in the very near future. So what is China going to do? Do we, do we perceive more security concerns then?
That is a very good question. Well, the fact that the United States has, for the first time, taken China as a primary competitor doesn't mean that necessarily that we will take them as enemy. Because we believe, first of all, they are not reasonable in taking China as the top strategic competitor, because the reasons as laid down in the defense report is really ridiculous, in that it argues that China, by using predatory economics, actually threatened its neighbors. But the point is, China is best trading partners with 130 countries, including the United States. So how can you threaten 130 countries into your best trading partner? This is what I have written, in my opinion, published in Financial Times. So this is not logical. And I don't believe at all that China should be taken as such a strategic competitor. This is wrong.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break, and you have been watching The Point with me, and I've been talking to Senior Colonel Zhou from China's Ministry of National Defense. We'll be back right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. To mark the 91st anniversary of the Army Day in China, I have been talking to Senior Colonel Zhou from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense. So let's talk a bit about the future goals of the PLA. As you mentioned at the beginning of the program, there are 3 main goals of the 3 main functions of the Chinese Army is to protect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the country, to protect China's overseas interests, and to shoulder China's international responsibility. And you have mentioned that China uses a rather unique approach towards that goal. How unique it is? Why?
Well, first of all, China has 14 neighbors on land, but we have resolved border disputes with 12 of them through peaceful negotiation. This is exceptional. And in spite of the fact that we have territorial disputes with some countries at sea, be it Japan or some ASEAN claimants, we never threaten to use force. For example, with ASEAN countries, we are discussing a code of conduct in the South China Sea. So even if we believe that this territory, the isles, the islands are ours, we never have threatened to use force to take back them. So that is why I said, in a very unique way, China is protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Well, some of our neighbors probably would not totally agree with you. For instance, many of our viewers in India probably think that, as seen from the border disputes last year, China may be not using direct military means to threaten, to protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity, but its so-called militarization has often been accused by many Western media as China's way of flexing its muscles, of intimidating its smaller neighbors. What is your reaction to that?
Well, yes. Some Western countries, especially the United States, talk about militarization, which refers to China's land reclamation in the South China Sea. But the China-Indian border is another totally different issue, because if you talk about what happened last year, that is actually the Donglang crisis, which is definitely Chinese territory. I'm talking about Donglang. But what is ridiculous is that India actually appear even in the land which it cannot claim to be Indian territory. So this kind of absurdity is almost self-evident. Talking about militarization in the South China Sea, first of all, there is no such agreed definition of what militarization really means. So if you say that China's land reclamation is militarization, could I argue that you regularized FONOP operation,
freedom of navigation operations,
into the waters 12 nautical miles off China coast is a kind of militarization? So this kind of a tit-for-tat accusation actually cannot be helpful for us to resolve any problems at all.
One of the things that people say is that China is changing the status quo. Maybe even that is the reason why India was particularly unpleased with what happened in Donglang, that by building roads, China is changing the situation, the balance of strengths in that region, and also with the island building in the South China Sea, it's also changing the balance of strengths possibly in that region. What is your reaction to that?
Well, in terms of the Donglang issue, first of all, India claims that it sent troops because of the friendship treaty in 2007. But if you even comb through the treaties, which is not very long, you just cannot find any words that would encourage such kind of behavior. It only says that when it comes to issues concerning national interests, the two sides will come to consultation. So no Bhutanese government have ever mentioned that it has invited the Indians to send troops. So that is about that issue. Well, in the South China Sea, again, there is no international law restricting land reclamation or even the space or size of land reclamation. So China's land reclamation is a kind of response to the similar activities of some ASEAN countries earlier, and it is not a response to the United States. But what is most ridiculous is that right now we are seeing a kind of what I would call the atypical security dilemma in the South China Sea. Security dilemma as a concept in international relations is understood to most people in that one side's behavior is actually ill-read by the other side, who in response would actually put up more efforts, which cause suspicion on the other side, and finally a conflict is inevitable. But the irony is, even if China and some ASEAN countries have some territorial disputes, this is between China and the ASEAN countries, and it is not about the military standoff. And the United States, a country which maintains that it takes no sides in the South China Sea issue, that it has no position on this issue, is actually becoming the major factor, as I would say, of instability in the South China Sea. This is the most unfortunate.
We'll talk about that in just a moment, about China and the United States, their military relationship. Let's focus back on China's overseas interests and how the PLA is supposed to protect it. We're talking about China trying to step up the Belt and Road Initiative with Chinese projects or collaborative projects in different parts of the world. So how can the PLA, under the current circumstances, make sure that Chinese interests can be protected in all of these places scattered around the world?
Actually, that is the biggest question for us. Because we don't have ready answers yet. The question is, China's national interest is not only associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, because wherever you go in the world, you would find Chinese products almost everywhere. So China's interest right now is global. It's everywhere. So
Chinese visitors, Chinese tourists, students.
Yes. Yeah. So that is why I sometimes argue the string of pearls theory is so ridiculous, because even if it is a string of so-called pearls of Chinese bases or Chinese harbors, it is just a lie. But talking even about Belt and Road, there are two roads, right? Because even because even the two roads cannot totally define China's national interests.
So how does the PLA plan to do part of that job at least?
Actually, we have already started this process, because now PLA is already trotting around the globe to fulfill essentially what we call the military operation other than war. That is confined to non-security threats, be it peacekeeping, counter-piracy, disaster relief, so on. And yes, we have also issued the national law about the counter-terrorism, which we did almost indirectly by supporting, for example, Central Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries in combating local terrorists. In that way, we actually are helping ourselves. For example, China, at the request of President Duterte of the Philippines, has actually provided 6,000 rifles, and one of the high-precision sniper rifle allegedly has killed the head of one terrorist group, because President Duterte said he was so happy he would even want this rifle to be taken back to be placed in a Chinese museum.
Let's talk about this base, this logistics support base in Djibouti that China has established. Is that going to be enough? Will China eventually send more troops abroad, set up more bases, and eventually even military bases abroad, as some people have speculated?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what Djibouti is used for. Let me argue like this. But for the counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden and Somali Basin, PLA probably will never think about establishing a logistics supply station in the Indian Ocean, because it has been so inconvenient without a logistics supply station. So that means your activity actually is a follow-up action of your behavior. First of all, you have to determine what kind of needs China does have overseas. When we talk about China's national interest and China's international responsibility, they can only be growing. So therefore, we cannot have a conclusive saying about how many military bases we would have in the world. But if we compare China's single logistics supply station to hundreds of military bases of the United States in the world, I would say the logic is different. So because we are not pursuing a kind of police role in the world, that is for sure. But because of Chinese people's determination to help our own interests and to help the people in the rest of the world, definitely will be doing more and more. And they don't have to be in military bases. For example, Chinese peacekeepers are in camps, and these camps are set up by the United Nations, so they're still working overseas.
China is doing a leading job basically at the moment in terms of UN peacekeeping missions. What's there for China to do that? And China is even doing more and more on that front. Yes.
China actually has sent peace observers very early, but ever since 1990 we have stepped up our efforts in peacekeeping, essentially by sending some kind of neutral forces. Those are signal forces, engineering troops, doctors, these kind of things, to show that we do not want to interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries, a kind of sensitivity for sovereignty. But, for example, President Xi Jinping announced in 2015 about a whole package of very big offers, for example, like setting up 8,000 standby troops, such as providing $100 million to African Union. All these indicators that China actually becomes more than ready to play a role in peacekeeping, which demonstrate our contribution to humanity and for the well-being of other people.
We all know these two movies that were very popular, Wolf Warrior 2 and Operation Red Sea. Personally, I've seen both of them, and they, especially the Operation Red Sea, shown how Chinese special forces rescued both Chinese citizens and foreign nationals in a foreign country, although it is kind of exaggerated artistically. And you have said that these two movies are very important because it predicts how Chinese people would expect our special forces should react in the future in terms of the use of force. Explain that. Why do you think these messages are important? Will Chinese special forces really going to be behaving like that in the future?
Well, as I said in the beginning, basically since 1980, PLA has never fired a bullet at anybody. And, but the fact that these two movies are so popular in China, especially about a hypothetical scenario of Chinese soldiers working overseas, is interesting because it shows that this is how Chinese people want our soldiers to behave, to use force decisively when needed. And in terms of a peacekeeping operation, actually, UN mandate have authorized UN peacekeepers to use force either for self-defense or for defense of mandate. And in the latest 10 mandates, the UN has also said you use all necessary means or by all necessary means. That means if you are operating in this kind of missions, in these situations that are clearly dangerous, you are allowed to use force, because that is interesting in that China has enjoyed peace for so long. But a day definitely will come where you have to use force, either to protect yourself or to protect other people. But
in one sentence, does that mean that China might adjust its peaceful rise strategy in the future?
Peaceful rise is about the behavior of China in terms of state craftsmanship. But we are talking about different scenarios. That is a good question, because the question could be put in another way. Where shall we have next war? I personally argue maybe it's not in China's periphery or with any neighbors. Maybe it's somewhere far away, be it at sea or be it in some remote land. This is possible given the fact that some of our soldiers, at least 13 of our peacekeepers from the military, have died in peacekeeping missions. So the case could happen far away from China.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Senior Colonel Zhou from the Chinese Ministry of National Defense, and Happy Army Day.
Thank you.
And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.